is from the book The Essex Boys and Mr. X by Heath Mayfield from Visual Feast Publishing. After the successful but brutal ambush and killings of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, Mr. X, Darren Nichols and Mick Steele made their getaway via the tracks and rat runs of the rural area back to the pub, where Mr. X then left Steele and Nichols' company and immediately climbed back into his vehicle, carrying the shotgun in the canvas bag, the sack of clothing that Mr. X and Mick Steele were supposed to have worn, plus the valuable contents of the bag recovered from the Range Rover. Then, for Mr. X to leave and never make contact with Steele or Nichols again. He was leaving both Steele and Nichols with the decision to keep their mouths shut concerning the murders, or at least never revealing Mr. X's true identity, no matter how much that it may be tempting to confide in anybody else, brag or embellish the tale in any way, or offer to reveal Mr. X's true identity in exchange for immunity from any personal prosecution in the murders. To Mr. X, as far as he was concerned, any scapegoat blamed for the murders was of no concern to him, as long as his true identity remained secret in any accusations. Mr. X would let the accusations of others run their course and have their consequences. That was the name of the game, according to Mr. X. He'd called a very trusted friend very shortly after the murders to inform him out of respect that he had completed his mission. Plus, for Mr. X to have made sure that it had specifically kept the Blundell brothers from being accused of being personally involved or held accountable, even though Mr. X knew that the Blundell brothers would not fold like a piece of origami paper under questioning or scrutiny. Mr. X had proclaimed that it intended to maintain the Blundell family pride, faith, trust, loyalty and respect amongst the known criminal fraternities. At the same time, he was harbouring a tormenting desire for vengeance. Did Biddy Blundell or someone like him then waste no time in contacting some of the well-connected criminal acquaintances to inform them that a local Essex problem and concern for many had been taken care of, and it had been successfully resolved, without ever disclosing to them Mr. X's identity? Did this information make its way to the police arm of the Untouchables, who would then be aware that the murders had taken place and the time had been deduced from the perceived call that they might have received in the late evening, informing them that the murders had taken place? But then, the corrupt arm of the police decided not to inform the local Essex police of the news, but to leave it up to some innocent individual who would eventually stumble upon the scene initially and not being aware that there had been 3 murders committed and the bodies of the victims left inside a stationary vehicle in a secluded enough location to inform the authorities. Plus, leaving the actual time of death impossible to establish. They were only relying on the time that was mentioned or indicated to be the time of death by the 2 interviewing detectives that questioned Mick Steele about his possible involvement with the murders, and of course the questionable phone call that was made by Jack Williams earlier in the evening of the murders to Darren Nichols that suited the prosecution case in their argument that Jack Williams was part of the conspiracy to coincide with Nichols' cockamamie story of Jack Williams being involved at all. The only fly in the ointment at the time was that it did not take Jack Williams long to suspect Mick Steele and Darren Nichols as possibly being involved in the murders as soon as the news of the murders had broken. However, he may never have confronted Steele or Nichols with his suspicions. Steele had tried his hardest not to involve his sound, reliable friend Jack Williams in the conspiracy, knowing that Jack Williams would not have agreed to be part in a callous murder, but Steele had been placed between a rock and a hard place and had been forced to carry on with his involvement in the conspiracy. Plus, Steele never at any stage admitted to Jack Williams that he or Darren Nichols was indeed a critical part of the conspiracy, and Jack Williams never pushed it. He knew that if he did, he would put his best mate in a tight spot, and he could never be accused of grassing. Did he just decide to let sleeping dogs lie? 6 months had passed since the murders, and although there was a lot of guesswork and rumours flying around concerning them, and so many individuals mentioned as possible suspects, it even gone so far as to arrest Leah Betts' father, Paul, a respected ex-policeman, on suspicion of the murders, possibly as retaliation for the death of his daughter. He would later be highly embarrassed by the accusations made of him by internet trolls. Rumours were abounding concerning the suspected involvement of corrupt police, and even a government or a covert military unit was circulating, and still do today. But although in fact such authorised groups may on occasion have to eliminate the odd threat to national security, the trio of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were more of a threat to people's health, no more than cigarettes or alcohol. They could not be classified as threats to national security, plus they don't target the average shitbags, they leave that up to the police. Darren Nichols had had plenty of time to reflect on the murders in the 6 months since it had taken place. He was cocky and confident that he was not a suspect in the murders, and he was a fellow who had a massive ego and opinion of himself. He was known to specifically brag to other individuals that Nichols had been in protective custody with, that he was the #1 cybergrass within the witness program at the time. The attention and the infamy that it was getting was blowing his kilt up. After Nichols had reassessed the murders, plus had concluded that he can construct and concoct such a believable tale as to the murders, at least by imagining and standards and by sticking as close to the original facts as possible, but with some slight variations put in place to make it appear that both Jack Womes and Mick Steele were the shooters in the murders, and made no mention of the existence of Mr. X, believing that Mr. X would not be bothered in taking action against Nichols for his betrayal, as long as Mr. X's involvement or his true identity disclosed. Was this an excuse for Nichols to lay the blame of the murders squarely at the feet of both Steele and Womes? Should he be arrested for any commercially classified drug dealings that he was involved in, which eventually did happen, when faced with undoubted guilt over being caught in possession of a commercial quantity of illegal drugs after being pulled over by police in his car, who had explicitly been surveillant and followed Nichols after receiving a tip-off that he was carrying a considerable amount of drugs for a transaction. A case of grassing on a grass, and Nichols was then involuntarily watching the police opening the van he was riding shotgun in so the police could examine the contents. Nichols was working with 2 corrupt detectives at the time and may have thought that he could get out of his arrest with the help of his corrupt police friends. After opening the car boot to check for illegal drugs, Nichols was placed under arrest by the officers. It was at this time, after being initially questioned over a drug importation matter, that he learned he was to be charged with the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, that Nichols had decided to play what he considered to be his trump cards. He would tell the police that he could help them with their inquiries regarding the Essex boys' murders. However, Nichols' supposed story as to the event stank to high heaven. As far as his professed unknowing involvement in the murder conspiracy, and only admitting to being the unwitting driver, duped into what he professed that he genuinely believed was going to be a straightforward drug transaction and no more. Nichols was considering that the police had no other reliable leads, collaborating evidence, forensic samples or reliable information as to the murders. They begrudgingly gave Nichols the benefit of the doubt and decided to base a case against Mick Steele and Jack Womes purely on his sworn testimony in open court. The case against Steele and Womes hinged on the evidence of Darren Nichols being believed by the jury. After all, he was the only prosecution witness. Nichols was presented as a reliable and accepted eyewitness to the murders by the prosecution counsel, and their evidence would concede with the supposed results of the investigations made by the police primary concerning the time reported as being when Jack Womes' phone call was recorded, but lacking the knowledge of his actual contents made to Darren Nichols' phone. The police and the prosecution had no other option but to allow or permit Nichols to be granted immunity from any criminal charges relating to the Rettendon murders and being laid against him in exchange for his sworn testimony in the trial of Michael Steele and Jack Womes. It appears that the original jury was satisfied with the prosecution case and the testimony of Nichols that they returned a guilty verdict against both Steele and Womes. At the same time, they knew not of the existence of Mr. X or his involvement in the murders. Another known police informer by the name of Billy Jasper, who was on remand at the time, claimed after the murders were well publicised that he was paid £5,000 for dropping off a stranger, a supposed ex-military specialist, in a laneway near the crime scene around midnight. This stranger was supposed to have travelled across several open fields to shoot Tate, Tucker and Rolfe and to rob them of a massive amount of cocaine, 4 kilograms worth of it. Jasper may have been relying on rumours about the reason for the murders that was already beginning to spread. This time was much later than the actual time of the murders. Still, Jasper was aware of the reports that some locals had heard gunfire around about midnight. His claim, however, can be discounted as being an attempt to gain immunity from the serious charge of an armed robbery from which he was being held. This is no different from the ploy that Nichols was using to gain protection from the charges. If we put the Billy Jasper version under the microscope, we see a different picture. Firstly, what experienced Special Forces member would pay an unknown person who could later recognise him? Is it reasonable that this person would give Jasper £5,000 to drive him up a narrow lane that was pockmarked with houses, so a supposed planned murder location? The lane led up to a small fenced parked area next to an open field. The killer would have had to jump over the fence, then hike up to 2 miles across open land before coming to the ambush point. How would he know for sure where the trio were and precisely what time they would be there? They were not murdered around midnight, as claimed by Jasper. They had indeed been murdered before they were due to be finishing their booked dinner at the restaurant. Jasper claims that he had to wait for 2 hours for the killer. At that time of night, the locals living in the lane would have found it very suspicious if a strange car had parked up for so long in the tiny location, and it was certainly not known to be used as a lover's lane. Hearing cars come into the lane was not unusual, but it would have been rare and certainly noticeable if a strange car parked in a location for no apparent reason. Neighbours are neighbours, and they tend to notice and remember things that are odd around their homes. Jasper claimed that the passenger was carrying a shotgun and a handgun in his bag. Why would a driver need to know this? Even if gunfire was heard around midnight, it could have easily been from game shooters known to frequent the area. They may have had permission to shoot or hunt in the area, as there was a popular licensed shooting range and hunting areas around the ambush area. Some witnesses reported not hearing any gunfire much earlier in the evening. Maybe they were watching television or listening to music and therefore did not hear the sound of the gunshots as well as they might have been if they'd have heard him in bed but not yet asleep. But there are other reports that gunfire was heard in the early evening. It must be pointed out that no matter what time in the evening that these men were murdered, the sunroof on the vehicle was open. This would indicate that it had been open to allow the warm air to escape, as they'd been travelling and sitting there for a while with the motor running. Because they were waiting in the warmth of the parked vehicle, some say as the reason there was no frost on the Range Rover. It must be realised that although there were 3 dead bodies inside the vehicles, they did not become stone cold upon their killing, although rigor mortis was already setting in. The temperatures of the bodies would have slowly decreased over time and helped stave off the frost on the vehicle. Photographs show that there were condensation marks inside the car. The chief investigating detective had commented on this when he first viewed the Range Rover after it had been discovered, and he was called onto the scene. He arrived after doing his morning shopping. Talk about being slack. An interesting thought that you may like to consider is that since the time that Darren Nichols entered the Witness Protection Programme in 1997, there have been no reports of him being seen again. This is not to say that he would voluntarily stick his head up only to be recognised. Just how would he look today to a worldwide audience thanks to the internet? But did he become too much of an annoying thorn in the side for the Untouchables, and they have long disposed of Darren Nichols permanently? Unfortunately for Jack Williams, he may have served over 20 years of a prison sentence not guilty of a crime of no more than the word of a convincing police informer. Nichols has no conscience, guilt or remorse and had the audacity to place into the frame an innocent man in order to secure his freedom from prosecution. This includes the drug charges initially brought against him before he offered to give evidence against Steele and Williams. Irrespective of the outcome or who was involved in the murders, it must be stressed again that neither Steele nor Williams have ever given evidence against the other. It is simply not within either of their natures. Mick Steele has always denied his involvement in the murders as a shooter, knowing that if he did, he would be defeating any chance of Jack Worms being believed as innocent and associate alone. What is your opinion on this explanation? Do you think that it passes muster as far as the implied innocence of Jack Worms is concerned and casts doubt, at least, on the integrity of Darren Nichols' testimony? Imagine that the defence counsel presenting this hypothetical case to the jury was a tenacious and extremely qualified criminal defence barrister and senior counsel. Or are you convinced that the original jury made the right decision in finding Steele and Worms equally guilty beyond reasonable doubt on the sole testimony of Darren Nichols? This account of the murders might not have helped to free Jack Worms from prison or to be offered as fresh evidence for him to secure another appeal for his sentence. It may not have helped or assist Jack's brother John in his heroic, loyal and determined fight to free his brother, but it may have just brought some comfort to Jack's family members if to help him hold on to the belief that Jack Worms was innocent of the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe. As for Mick Steele's supposed guilt in the murders, may they have to reconsider his denied declarations of his involvement and guilt concerning the murders, and would the Untouchables ever allow Mick Steele to even get to the stage of giving evidence on behalf of Jack Worms? Before Jack was granted parole, as a further development in his confinement circumstances, he had recently been granted a slight reduction in his sentence due to his remarkable controlled temperament and his passive attitude and respect for others, both criminals and prison staff, for the whole period of his incarceration, which is flying in the face of the accusations that he is a relentless, ruthless man and is as psychopathic, violent and unfeeling as he was portrayed to be by Darren Nichols. Nichols has always hammered the fact that he accuses Worms of being the shooter, and simply because Jack Worms has long seen through Nichols as an unreliable and untrustworthy character. Plus, quite recently, Mick Steele has been awarded £40,000 in compensation concerning a matter of toothache that he suffered with for just about the whole period of his sentence, without being allowed to receive dental treatment for his complaint. Some may object about this payment on the grounds of Steele being a convicted killer. But if one has ever suffered from a severe case of a toothache, then really one has to ask themselves, can you imagine what it would be like to have to live in such constant pain, agony or discomfort for decades? Let us say if you were just a normal everyday citizen and were refused help or relief at every turn, one would have to understand Mick Steele's right to receive an intervention and sue if denied it. Could Darren Nichols have been nailed for perjury or been tried as an accessory to murder before and after the fact? Of course not. He got away with murder with the immense help of a highly blinkered, if not incompetent, police investigation. It was said that he laughed up his sleeve at the gullibility of the jury, who today may be ashamed for the returning of a guilty verdict, especially in the case of Jack Worms. The police can claim a result, having 5 known criminals off the street in the process, but any mention of police involvement, coercion, assistance, or the condoning of the murders is vehemently denied by them. The case is closed and should be kept that way, as far as they are concerned. Their exposed incompetence or lack of due diligence in investigating this set of murders still stings them today. The last thing that they want is to reassociate themselves with the crime in any way. After all, is it not true that the police are not bothered by who is guilty or innocent of a crime if they can make a charge stick and have a good chance of gaining a conviction? Then, in their books, anybody around whom they can fit the evidence with confidence and benefit will do. Getting a conviction means that their police job appears to have been done. Let the convicted try to appeal it. Is Darren Nichols even still alive? No matter how much he would like to fan his ego, he knows in his heart that if Mr. X knows of Nichols' betrayal, he may very well be part of the national Untouchables, who have the ability through their organisation and contacts to locate and kill Nichols should they wish to. Can he ever relax and enjoy life without trying to fool himself, even with a new identity and location? Nichols may have claimed that he did not fear either Steele or Worms as far as retaliation was concerned, but in reality he would have excellent reason to be bothered about Mr. X, knowing how stubborn and determined and homicidally vindictive he could be. Now, it may come as an unwanted surprise or letdown to all overly dramatic conspiracy theorists who have jumped to their conclusions, but these murders were not committed by a covert arm of the law or any sanctioned and warranted military personnel, nor were they undertaken by any paramilitary organisation. If this was the case, there would have been no used shotgun cartridge shells left to be found and recovered. The area immediately surrounding the Range Rover, particularly any distinctive tracks that may have been made by said team or squad, would have been swept away with the aid of some surrounding foliage in order to contaminate or destroy the evidence. The same method of obliterating evidence that may have been left by them would not have been needed or applied in the case of the various tyre tracks that have been seen in abundance leading into Workhouse Lane and down the ensuing tracks, as none of them would have been made by any vehicle by the imagined hit squad would have arrived in. All of the recognisable and photographed tracks were attributed to having been left by innocent regular visitors to the lane area, prominently for the purpose of shooting. Then there would be the tracks of the two local farmers, including one of the Fearbold brothers, Peter, a champion shotgun shooter himself, and Mr. Ken Jiggins. They would have travelled down the track to feed their pheasants in the fields that lay ahead. In doing so, they could have accidentally run over and crushed one of the used shotgun shells that had been left lying on the track. The murders were committed by a single person who held a deep-seated hatred of the victims and an unshakable commitment to kill them with extreme malice, and also as a signal to others. One man angered to such an extent as to be determined to kill his intended targets for his personal pleasure. Megalomania, power trip, thrill kills, jealousy was the real motive for the killings, no matter how many people may have been involved in the plot to allow him to do so. Of course, the killer had some assistance, as in reliable intelligence and transport to and from the scene, but only one person pulled the trigger of a single shotgun used in all three of the killings. Even if Mick Steele did admit his guilt and involvement, would he still be concerned that Mr. X, an agent of his, could get to him? Mr. X had no beef with Jack Worms, therefore he should not begrudge Jack finally enjoying a better quality of life different from the one he had lived for so long, knowing that he was most certainly set up by Darren Nichols. If Mr. X were to die soon and decided to give a sort of deathbed confession, would that prove Jack's innocence? Who would be against such a confession coming to light? It would surely be the authorities, as imagine the amount of compensation they would have to pay for Jack Worms for a wrongful arrest and prosecution, for a miscarriage of justice. Add in the value of the golden years of his life that should have been, and you can count on millions and millions of pounds. He would deserve every penny and more, because he's never going to get them years back, no matter how much money he may have, or he cannot buy them. After reviewing the facts available to us, many may have considered that the truth has become so entangled in rumours and suspicions. Here is something for you to consider now. After all, it is said there are three sides to every story. Side A's account, side B's account, and then there is the truth. Do you think the following explanation could be the truth? And can the truth be hidden in fiction? In the final chapter of the Essex Boys and Mr. X, we look at another explanation that has been compiled from previously unreleased and suppressed official documentation relating to the case. It is an explosive report about the real